The morning sun had barely touched the glass towers of Palo Alto when the silence shattered. Black SUVs swarmed the gated mansion, their engines growling like predators circling prey. Federal agents stormed the pristine estate, boots thudding against polished marble floors, once reserved for charity galas and magazine spreads. The man who had ruled boardrooms with arrogance stood frozen as steel cuffs clicked around his wrists. Adrian Pierce, once Silicon Valley's golden boy, was dragged from his sanctuary in full view of flashing news cameras. Reporters shouted questions that would never receive answers, while cardboard boxes marked "Evidence, 8 years," piled higher inside. What had once been symbols of dominance, glass walls, sweeping staircases, imported art, were reduced to a crime scene inventory. The empire he built on control was slipping beyond his reach, and for the first time, his name carried the weight of ruin. Inside the mansion, the silence carried its own accusation. Where the scent of Colombian coffee once drifted, only the metallic tang of dried blood remained. A faint trail dotted the flawless marble, meandering toward an empty garage where luxury vehicles sat untouched, one space vacant. On the kitchen counter, her wedding ring gleamed coldly under recessed lights, a circle of gold stripped of meaning. The house that once staged perfection felt hollow, like a museum abandoned overnight. Photographs of lavish vacations stared down from gilded frames, mocking the reality of bruises hidden behind designer fabric. Adrian had always believed silence meant control, yet this silence mocked him, thick and final. Each echoing step through the empty rooms amplified the truth. She was gone. For the man who thought he owned every detail of his life, the absence felt louder than any accusation shouted from a crowd. Across town, markets opened with numbers tumbling in crimson. Pierce Tech, once a beacon of innovation, became the day's disaster headline. Stock tickers bled red as billions evaporated in hours, the empire collapsing faster than any hostile takeover Adrian had orchestrated against others. Investors crowded trading floors, eyes glued to screens flashing losses in percentages that felt like lifeblood draining. Analysts filled cable news slots with speculation, their words sharp as blades: fraud, liability, collapse. On social platforms, hashtags trended with fury, while protesters uploaded footage of themselves outside Adrian's gated home, chanting for accountability. The fall was public, merciless, and accelerating, every second broadcast live to an audience hungry for downfall. In the echo chamber of finance, reputations could vanish faster than money. By noon, Adrian's face was no longer the portrait of genius. It had become the icon of disgrace, unraveling before the entire world. The package arrived with unnerving precision, hand-delivered by a courier who vanished before questions could be asked. Inside lay a garment once paraded across charity stages, a designer dress stiffened with dried blood. The crimson stains spoke louder than any headline, each mark a frozen moment of violence turned into evidence. A note pinned to the fabric carried no ambiguity. This was not just exposure, it was reckoning. Adrian dropped the dress onto his marble floor, the fabric hitting like iron, echoing through the empty mansion. The threads seemed to breathe with accusation, binding the past to the present in an unbroken chain. In that moment, the empire of curated appearances shattered. What had once been hidden behind closed doors had stepped into the light, embodied in a single garment. The dress was no longer fashion, it was testimony, and its weight was unbearable. The air inside the morgue was sterile, heavy with the scent of chemicals and resignation. Detective Luis Alvarez pulled back the sheet with clinical efficiency, but the sight beneath was anything but routine. Naomi Pierce lay silent, her skin pale against a steel slab, a scar above her brow still visible from childhood. The body bore no jewelry, not even the wedding band once displayed for cameras. Death had stripped her of performance, leaving behind only truth. The medical examiner noted the mixture of pills and alcohol, the kind of ending that blurred accident and intent. To Alvarez, it looked less like escape and more like surrender, a final act after years of silent suffering. For Adrian, it was a paradox. The woman who had vanished was confirmed gone, yet her presence haunted every corner of his collapsing empire, sharper in absence than in life. Leaving the morgue, Adrian moved through Houston's humid air like a ghost himself, disoriented, fractured. His phone vibrated, the screen glowing with a name he thought extinguished. Naomi's number delivered a simple message: "Now you know. This is just the beginning." The words turned reality inside out, blurring the line between death and vengeance. Each vibration of the phone felt like a pulse from beyond, mocking his certainty, unraveling his grip. Someone alive, someone intimate, someone deliberate was pulling threads he could not trace. For the first time in years, he felt hunted. The message was not just a taunt, it was a declaration. Whatever he believed ended in that morgue had only set the stage for what came next. Fear settled not in the heart of a victim, but in the chest of a man who had always mistaken dominance for power. Years earlier, Naomi Pierce performed her morning rituals inside a house that gleamed like a showroom. Glass walls reflected perfection, concealing chaos within. The kitchen, worth more than most homes, became her stage of survival. She measured her movements with precision, sleeves concealing bruises, lips trained to curve into smiles that felt like shackles. Every surface reflected her image, but none revealed her truth. The walls had absorbed too many screams, soundproofed into silence. She knew the number of steps from stove to panic room, a calculation engraved by necessity, not safety. Every gesture, every phrase was rehearsed compliance, survival dressed as devotion. For outsiders, the estate symbolized achievement. For Naomi, it was a gilded cage. Each morning's performance added to the mask, but behind it, she was counting more than steps. She was counting days, waiting for the precise moment when survival would transform into resistance. Naomi perfected the art of appearing agreeable, her smile a weapon forged against suspicion. Adrian controlled every variable around her, from schedules to conversations, reducing her world to rehearsed submission. He monitored tone, measured posture, and demanded gestures that suggested harmony while concealing fractures. What others called affection was leverage. What appeared as tenderness was domination. Her smile became a performance costume, a uniform of captivity. In photographs, it shimmered under chandeliers, at galas, in magazines, projecting an image of partnership. Inside, it cost her fragments of identity each time it appeared. The trap was not the mansion, or even Adrian's wealth. It was the perception that she lived a dream. Every forced curve of her lips reminded her of the truth. Freedom demanded deception. To endure was to comply, but to survive was to hide hatred beneath the same expression that once betrayed her spirit. Behind a wall of designer shoes and gowns she never chose, Naomi kept her secret world. A safe concealed by indulgence housed the tools of rebellion. A burner phone, drives cataloged with dates, and a photograph frozen in violence. Adrian, his knuckles bloodied, stood in that image over her crumpled body, unaware that hidden cameras captured every moment he believed erased. Each item was more than storage, it was strategy. The drives held not just images, but years of a marriage documented as evidence. Every act of cruelty, archived in silence. Naomi knew the risks. Discovery meant annihilation. But with every recording, every click of storage, her power grew quietly in the shadows. The vault was her cathedral of resistance, built behind walls meant to cage her. In that small, hidden space, Naomi was no longer captive. She was a strategist laying the groundwork for war. Adrian's empire appeared untouchable, but one failed acquisition cracked his facade. The Henderson deal, meant to expand his biotech dominance, collapsed under ethical scrutiny. Publicly, he maintained poise, jaw set as though challenges were routine. Privately, volcanic fury built beneath the surface. He viewed the rejection not as business loss but as personal betrayal. Every dollar slipped through his fingers became justification to punish, to reclaim control in the only environment where he felt absolute, his home. Investors saw a man calculating recovery. Naomi saw the predator preparing to strike. Corporate turbulence became fuel for domestic terror, an equation he had long repeated. His failures outside became bruises inside. The deal's death was not just financial, it triggered the night where survival meant more than compliance, where Naomi's calculations shifted from endurance toward the precise, dangerous act of rebellion she had been preparing for years. That night unfolded not as chaos, but as ritual brutality. The details blurred into fragments, a blouse torn at the seam, a broken glass on marble, the metallic taste of blood sharp in the air. Naomi's body endured what her spirit no longer could, but her eyes remained steady, fixed on survival. She had hidden a recorder beneath fabric, its red light glowing faintly against darkness. Each insult, each threat, each strike became evidence captured in digital permanence. For years she had worn compliance as armor, but this night she shifted, no longer absorbing violence as silence, but converting it into ammunition. Pain became documentation, humiliation became testimony. When it ended, her body lay battered, but her resolve was iron. She clutched the device like a lifeline, knowing that in its memory resided the undoing of the man who believed her brokenness was permanent. In the aftermath of destruction, Naomi whispered 2 words into the hidden recorder, words sharp as blades and coated with intent. They were not pleas, not cries for help, but a signal. Across distance, they belonged to someone listening, someone prepared. The phrase was less confession than command, marking the transition from endurance to offense. The recorder captured not just the brutality inflicted, but the resolve it birthed. For years, she had been documenting a history no one saw, and with those words, the archive became weaponized. It was no longer enough to survive. Survival had become strategy. With that whisper, she initiated the war she had long been scripting. Somewhere far from the mansion's gleaming walls, her twin, Camille Ellis, would understand. The opening move had been made, and the game Adrian thought he mastered had shifted to a board he could not control. In Houston, Camille Ellis received a signal. Files she had quietly prepared for years were opened, labeled meticulously with dates and timestamps. As a lawyer, she understood evidence. As a sister, she understood vengeance. Naomi's message confirmed readiness. Camille's office, filled with case files of other survivors, now became headquarters for the most personal case of her career. The screen glowed with folders documenting 8 years of cruelty. Each drive represented more than data. It represented a life stolen piece by piece. Camille's training had prepared her for legal battles, but this was larger. It was systemic exposure, a dismantling of power constructed on violence. In that moment, grief fused with resolve. Her sister's suffering would not remain confined to hidden safes and whispered words. It would be amplified into a storm that would consume the man responsible, turning his empire into kindling for justice. Pre-dawn shadows stretched across the mansion's circular drive. Naomi's car pulled away in silence, headlights dissolving into darkness. Inside, the home felt paused, as though time itself had stopped. A phone lay shattered on the counter, severing the surveillance Adrian had depended on. Jewelry boxes gaped with empty spaces. Closets showed gaps where clothes once hung. She had moved not in panic, but with deliberate calculation, leaving behind artifacts designed to wound. The ring, the broken phone, the trail of blood. Each absence was an indictment, each missing item a declaration of agency. For the first time, Naomi controlled the narrative. The house, once saturated with her rehearsed compliance, now rang hollow, mocking the man who believed ownership was permanence. By the time Adrian woke, the woman he thought belonged to him had already vanished, transformed from prisoner to architect of his downfall.
When Adrian awoke, absence screamed louder than any alarm. The house failed to deliver its usual cues of control. The aroma of brewed coffee, the measured footsteps of compliance, the quiet acknowledgement of his authority. Instead, silence stretched oppressive and foreign. He searched rooms for her presence, but each doorway opened into emptiness. The garage revealed her vehicle missing. The nightstand displayed a discarded ring, and the kitchen counter bore the broken remains of a phone he once tracked. What he mistook as obedience had dissolved into strategy. Control was no longer his, it had been inverted. In that moment, the man who believed he orchestrated every detail of his environment confronted the void of autonomy. He had always assumed her silence meant consent. Now, silence revealed itself as departure, and the walls of his empire echoed not with compliance, but with abandonment. The illusion of control fractured further when Adrian's assistant, Claire Sutton, delivered news with quiet precision. Credit cards had been canceled, bank accounts closed, and files siphoned from his private servers. The mechanisms he relied upon to monitor and contain had been dismantled overnight. Claire's voice, once loyal, now carried neutrality that bordered on disgust. Her resignation letter was placed on his desk, severing the chain of obedience. For a man accustomed to absolute loyalty, the betrayal felt surgical. His empire was bleeding from inside, each account closure another vein severed. Technology, once his instrument of dominance, now became the weapon used against him. Claire's exit marked more than professional loss. It symbolized the unraveling of the fear-based control he had over others. Adrian realized too late that the foundation he built was not indestructible. It was brittle, and the cracks had widened beyond repair.
An email arrived without signature, but with unmistakable clarity. Attached was footage, high definition and undeniable. Naomi flinching under his hand, his voice threatening in tones once masked as affection. Timestamps lined the bottom of each frame, documenting not moments of passion, but of cruelty. The subject line read simply, "Day 1 of your education." It was the beginning of a countdown he could not stop. Within hours, the footage spread beyond his control. Board members, investors, even journalists received copies. The world witnessed the man he truly was, not the polished figure who graced covers and podiums. For the first time, Adrian's carefully maintained narrative collided with unfiltered truth. He had always believed evidence was his to suppress. Now evidence had become the architect of his exposure, and the education promised was a syllabus of destruction written in his own brutality. The streets outside his mansion transformed into a stage for fury. Protesters gathered with signs painted in bold strokes. Phrases like, "No more silence," and "Justice for Naomi." Chants rose into the air, their rhythm steady, their conviction unyielding. Cameras captured every angle, streaming images across news outlets and social platforms. Comment threads erupted with outrage. Hashtags climbed into trending lists, and the collective voice of strangers amplified into judgment louder than any courtroom. Inside, Adrian watched through bulletproof glass, his once private fortress now exposed as a monument to hypocrisy. The man who once controlled narratives with press releases and donations found himself powerless against a storm fueled by truth. Public opinion moved faster than lawyers, harsher than any boardroom reprimand. For a man who thrived on image, this was execution. His empire was no longer admired, it was condemned, brick by brick, in real time.
As Adrian scrambled for explanations, revelations unfolded in unexpected places. Private investigator Jack Mercer laid out photographs across a battered desk. Each image showed Naomi not as a captive, but as a strategist. She was seen in women's shelters, at group meetings, and in discreet discussions with advocates. She had built alliances in secret, threading herself into an underground network dedicated to helping survivors disappear when systems failed them. Adrian, who once believed she needed guidance for the simplest errands, now faced evidence of a double life. The photographs showed a woman unrecognizable to him, confident, animated, alive. Mercer's files revealed Naomi had not been merely waiting for rescue. She had been orchestrating escape with precision. The network represented resilience larger than one marriage, larger than one abuser. It was a community of survival, and Naomi had been one of its fiercest architects. Among Mercer's photographs, one image shifted the narrative entirely. Taken in a Houston coffee shop, it showed Naomi, or someone identical, laughing freely across from a woman with the same face. Camille Ellis, Naomi's twin, entered the story not as background, but as a force. The photo revealed more than resemblance. It suggested collaboration, a shared plan layered in secrecy. Adrian's mind spiraled into paranoia. Had the woman in his home always been Naomi, or had Camille stepped into her place at times? The ambiguity became a weapon, eroding his confidence in memory itself. For investigators, the twin dynamic complicated timelines. For Adrian, it destabilized reality. The image was more than proof of life. It was proof of strategy. Two women sharing one face had orchestrated his unraveling,
and the lines between truth and performance blurred until he no longer trusted his own past.
Detective Alvarez aligned records with surgical precision. Naomi's death, confirmed by fingerprints and dental records, occurred days before footage and leaks continued surfacing. The contradiction bent reality into impossible shapes. Either the dead had risen, or the living had assumed her identity with flawless execution. Camille's role expanded from grieving sister to executor of vengeance, wielding Naomi's evidence as if it were her own weapon. For Adrian, the contradiction gnawed at his sanity. The morgue had shown him death, yet his inbox pulsed with her voice, her presence, her judgment. Law enforcement sought clarity in the timeline. Naomi's life ended, but her archive lived on through a twin determined to weaponize it. For Adrian, clarity dissolved into fear. He was not fighting one woman or even one death. He was trapped in a war against memory itself, curated by two indistinguishable faces. The dress reappeared not as fashion, but as artifact. Forensic specialists sealed it in evidence bags, documenting each fiber, each bloodstain, hardened into testimony. Once a symbol of glamour, it now embodied the violence stitched into Naomi's life. The fabric carried DNA that linked private brutality to public exposure. Photographs captured it under harsh lighting, turning couture into condemnation. The garment told a story Adrian could no longer suppress. Glamour was camouflage, and beneath the surface lay wounds. The dress traveled from courier to laboratory, from secrecy to record, each step stripping away illusion. For investigators, it was material proof. For the public, it was metaphor. In its folds, silence ended, and violence became visible. The item that once adorned stages of wealth had transformed into an unyielding witness, testifying louder than words. It was evidence that clothed truth in unmistakable clarity.
In a sunlit office overlooking Houston's skyline, Camille Ellis orchestrated her moves with precision. Her reflection in the window resembled Naomi's, but her posture radiated control. She held files thicker than case law, evidence meticulously compiled and ready for release. From her desk, she guided the unraveling of Adrian's empire not with threats, but with strategy. She knew the weight of exposure. She knew how reputations crumbled when truth surfaced in sequence. Each phone call placed was another lever pulled, each email drafted, another domino positioned. Camille did not seek theatrics. She sought inevitability. Adrian had underestimated the power of a woman who not only survived beside her sister, but had trained her entire career for battles like this. The office became a war room, and the enemy was not simply a man, it was the system that enabled him. Camille was determined to dismantle both. The evidence Naomi gathered became Camille's arsenal, but the strategy extended beyond personal vengeance. Federal statutes provided weapons sharper than anger. Surveillance funded with corporate accounts, phone calls placed through company lines, investigators hired through business ledgers, all documented and irrefutable. Camille coordinated with agent Natalie Chen, aligning domestic cruelty with financial misconduct to elevate the case to federal jurisdiction. The charges evolved from private violence to systemic corruption. Fraud, conspiracy, digital stalking. Adrian's empire itself became evidence against him. His company transformed into an accomplice. Each legal domino toppled the next, aligning a path toward inevitable prosecution. For Camille, the pursuit of justice was no longer personal alone. It was structural. She wielded law like a scalpel, cutting through excuses and facades. The man who believed his wealth insulated him discovered instead that his own fortune had built the gallows awaiting him.
Camille's offensive extended beyond court filings. She infiltrated Adrian's professional circles with charm and precision, presenting herself as a sympathetic listener at conferences, dinners, and informal meetings. Executives accustomed to admiration confided in her, unaware their disclosures became weapons. Over drinks and handshakes, secrets spilled. Details of Adrian's manipulations, whispers of questionable deals, hints of ethical corners cut.
Camille recorded not in devices, but in memory, cataloging every slip. Men who mirrored Adrian's arrogance underestimated her, viewing her as audience rather than adversary. That arrogance became their downfall. By the time they realized their confidences had been harvested, the information was already embedded in legal strategies and media kits. Camille turned the very culture that empowered men like Adrian into her tool. Social engineering became exposure, and the empire that thrived on secrecy found itself undone by conversations it believed harmless. In a locked drawer sat drives labeled by year, their contents arranged like chapters in a book of cruelty. Naomi's recordings, photographs, and notes had been transformed by Camille into media kits designed for maximum impact. Timers were set, distribution lists prepared, embargoes lifted in unison. News outlets across the nation would receive synchronized deliveries, each file curated to tell a story impossible to dismiss. Footage of violence paired with financial records, photographs paired with timestamps, journal entries paired with hospital bills. Together, they built a narrative that no press release could counter, no lawyer could spin. Camille understood the power of sequence. Truth revealed slowly could be ignored. Truth unleashed in avalanche became undeniable. The kits were not just evidence, they were execution plans, designed to dismantle reputation in a single wave. The countdown had begun, and silence was no longer an option.
Adrian's once limitless network constricted around him. Banks froze accounts, partners severed contracts, and emails piled with subject lines reading, "Termination of agreement." His calendar, once filled with opportunities, became crowded with subpoenas and summons. In boardrooms across the country, his name transformed from asset to liability, whispered in tones of betrayal and disgust. He moved through his aquarium-like office, glass walls that once symbolized transparency, now enclosing him like a cage. Every phone call carried another loss. Every notification, another door slammed shut. The empire he believed impenetrable collapsed from the outside in, leaving him stranded in isolation. For a man who thrived on control, the realization was suffocating. He no longer dictated the narrative. Instead, he awaited the next blow, each one delivered with precision by a woman who had mastered patience. The doors were not just closing, they were locking permanently. The raid stripped Adrian's sanctuary of illusion. Federal agents cataloged every artifact, from laptops to handwritten notes, boxing up the remnants of his double life. Among the items discovered were photographs of Naomi's bruises, arranged with chilling chronology, and medical records disguised as accidents. One envelope contained his own notes, written with clinical detachment, describing behavioral corrections, like experiments on human obedience. Agent Natalie Chen studied the documents without expression, her silence more damning than words. Adrian insisted it was context, misunderstanding, discipline misinterpreted, but the evidence spoke for itself, organized, meticulous, irrefutable. What he believed private reflections of power now stood as proof of pathology. The empire built on perception crumbled under the weight of receipts. His home, once a fortress of secrecy, was dismantled room by room, each item removed a nail in the coffin of the narrative he thought unshakable.
On the mansion walls hung photographs curated for image, charity galas, award ceremonies, vacations. Each frame captured Adrian smiling, hand placed firmly on Naomi's waist. Once, these images projected success and partnership. Now, under the glare of investigative lights, they appeared as exhibits in a trial of coercion. Naomi's smile looked strained, her posture rigid, her eyes distant. What had been overlooked by admirers became obvious as evidence of control. Adrian stood before the gallery of his life, realizing he had documented his own indictment in portraits meant to showcase triumph. The mirrors of glass walls no longer reflected mastery, but revealed hollowness. His legacy collapsed, not in boardrooms, but on living room walls, reinterpreted through the lens of exposure. The shattering was not physical, but perceptual. His carefully crafted reality refracted into shards, leaving behind only the undeniable truth of domination and abuse. As Adrian was led from the mansion in handcuffs, cameras captured the fall of a man who once believed himself untouchable. Protesters outside shouted not just at him, but for every victim whose silence mirrored Naomi's. Inside, a quiet office in Houston, Camille Ellis closed a file labeled Naomi Pierce, Legacy. Her hand lingered before she slid it into an archive. Beside it, a fresh folder waited, embossed with a single word: restitution. The war had shifted from exposure to reconstruction, from tearing down one man to challenging a system. Camille's desk glowed in morning light, papers stacked with intent, phones silent only for the moment. Justice had begun with vengeance, but it would not end there. The story was no longer only Naomi's. It had become a manifesto, carried forward by the sister who turned grief into unrelenting, systematic pursuit of truth.